Welcome everyone to the fourth webinar here in our Q1 series with Quadrant. The topic of today is commercial strategy and doing more with less as well. My name is Jonathan. I'm a director here at Quadrant, and I've worked with this topic for basically all of my career, and I think that constitutes me as a big commercial strategy nerd and a growth nerd. The first ad plug of 3 for the session here, just very briefly about Quadrant Consulting. If you don't know us so well, we are a boutique management consultancy. We are focused on growth, commercial transformation, and work primarily with sales, marketing, digital in order to drive growth with our clients. We are about 40 consultants, all come with a functional background in this space as well. Even though that we are a Copenhagen-born and operate out of Copenhagen consultancy, our clients are large European B2B clients with a global scope and global organizations. So we are very privileged to work in this space and with these clients. We are part of the Elixir group of consultancies, so we have presence in the UK, US, France, and Africa, which is really a great benefit to us and our clients. We like to think a lot about the space around growth and commercial. We like to write a lot as well to try and share what we know and learn. We'll do that today in the webinar, but also in a few of our publications, which I'll come back to a little bit later. We are senior-led in our delivery, and that comes from us being not blue-collar, but white-collar craftsmen. We are operators and really love this space, and all of us, we are hands-on in the way that we approach engagements. And it's this hands-on experience that is driving the content of the webinar today and getting more out of less from your commercial strategy. So some of you may have thought, what on earth was that sticker, get one, or buy one, get one free? Well, it actually comes from an engagement I had with a CMO a couple of years back. She showed me that within the last 3 years, her budget had essentially been cut in half, and the same with her staff. But her targets didn't change. So she framed it as, and I really liked it, and I wanted to bring it here today as the worst offer you can get. She got one and had to give 2. But I think that's not an isolated case. 2 for 1 is compelling for consumers, but as commercial strategy owners, we're actually being forced quite often to deliver twice the input for the same, or twice the output for the same input. So that's kind of the challenge that we're going to deal with today. So the agenda for the webinar is we look a little bit at what's driving the need for more outputs, and what's the big imperative that we need to focus on in order to alleviate that. Then we'll dive into a few barriers that we see that block us from delivering better commercial strategies and outputs. Then I think there are 3 big shifts that commercial strategy owners, they need to make and try and instill in their organizations in order to be able to deliver at this much higher output level with fewer inputs. And then as an operator, I like to get practical, so we'll dive into a few practical tips and blueprints that you can take back to your next session or conversation around commercial strategy and how to get more for less. So let's dive into it. The need for more outputs, that is very real because the inputs, they're going down. The time that sellers spend on direct selling activities, that used to be about half of their time in 2010, but now it's at 29%. They are spending a lot of time on admin and systems and meetings and not so much on actually directly engaging with prospects and clients in order to grow. We're also seeing a general downward trend in marketing budgets over time. Of course, a big dip during COVID, but the trend is still holding. And that's also what we hear when we are out having conversations in industry, that budgets are being pressured and FTEs are also being pressured in that function as well. But the targets, they don't change proportionally. And then I think the last indicator here is just on commercial hiring in general. This is data from LinkedIn. There are fewer postings around frontline and commercial-oriented jobs on LinkedIn over time as well. So the inputs for actually driving your commercial strategy, they are going down. But the ambitions, they're actually going up at the same time. By and large, the growth expectations have around doubled in a decade. And if we look at the forecasted earnings for a lot of the clients that we work with and their competitors, they are also, of course, ambitious and want to grow at the same time as their commercial inputs are going down. So what do firms do about this? Well, I think a lot of you and us included in the past, they use the same playbook. We're trying to squeeze the existing capacity. How do we do that? Well, we try and add more. We do more training for sellers and marketeers and how to use new platforms and systems and tech. We add more. The tech stack increases. We build tools. We buy tools. We start using new tools. That would be the silver bullet. No, let's automate. Let's do more automation. Take work away from people. Maybe we need more goals and KPIs. Let's do more activity, more projects, more initiatives. And now, of course, the big thing is AI. AI, it will be the solver of everything. Let's do more training on that, more use cases. But I think the result so far for a lot of companies is that it's relatively underwhelming, that simply doing more is not generating the size of the outputs and change that is actually needed in order to be able to deliver over time on the targets that you are provided with the inputs that you are given. So I think the struggle is definitely real. So what do you do about it? Well, I think it comes very much down to this notion here and the mindset. If I asked people what they wanted, they would have said a faster horse. It's credited to Henry Ford, but I actually think that he didn't ever say that. It's something that came up later. But you shouldn't believe everything you see on the internet. But I like that thing around the mentality. And I think at the core of it, it's about you actually have to do something radically different in order to get a radically different outcome. And that, I think, is the big imperative when it comes to getting more out of less. We are creating our commercial strategy game boards around what are we going to do, what are we going to change. We have to have items there that radically change how you operate. Doing more training, more AI, etc. That is, in many respects, looking at the incremental part of the scale, not the radical. Can training radically change how you operate? Yes. Can AI do that? Yes. But it comes from actually working with it from that standpoint. How do we radically change what we do and how we do it in order to radically change the outputs that we are looking to get? I think that's what driving the need for more outputs, and the big imperative here again is we need to do something radically different if you want radical change and a lot higher outputs. Radical, that's a pretty dangerous word for a lot of people. I think there's some sentiment around that doesn't ring right in a lot of people's ears. But if you actually look at the definition, it's something that is proceeding from a root and is being very different from the usual or traditional. I think the key thing here is that radical does not equal risk. So doing something radically different is not also equal to a much higher risk taking as well. I think that's important to keep in mind. Of course, risk is often associated with higher outputs, but I think especially when it comes to commercial strategy owners and the commercial frontline, sometimes we are too risk averse, but we are also not taking the opportunities on changing how we do things that is carrying low risk, but can actually significantly change the outcomes that we are looking to get. And then the natural question becomes, Okay, so then what are some of the barriers that are stopping us from doing things radically different and getting those outputs? And today we have tried to zoom in on 4 barriers that we see time and time again that is almost baked into some organizations. So the first one is going straight into doing instead of thinking, actually designing for growth. The second one is actually failing to leverage your collaborators and some of these enabling functions that we are becoming more and more dependent on as commercial operators and commercial strategy owners as well. We need to engage them, and we're dependent on them in order to build the solutions that we need in order to get those outputs. The third one here is around actually not dealing with the enablers of commercial acceleration, some fundamental things that are helping drive the teams that are driving the actual commercial strategy. If that's not aligned, you will have a hard time. I think the last one, which is close to my heart, actually not leveraging what you already have, waiting for that big next silver bullet and blockbuster product launch as the way to actually get the outputs and performance that you need instead of using what you already have. That was the flyover on the barriers, but I think it's worthwhile just diving into each of them in a little bit more detail. So for a lot of organizations, there's a big pressure to act. A lot of organizations are designed to be doer organizations. As soon as you start seeing an issue that could be, well, our sales organization are not hitting their target. Well, let's plan for some training. Let's do something about it. Let's go and do the activity and then watch the impact. There are enough issues to go around, but I think the big switch here is actually thinking more in terms of what I call a solver organization. Yes, there's an issue, but what's the problem actually? And working more deeply with that instead of going to conclusions, and actually spending some time iterating on how could a solution look like? What could be some of these radically different things that we could do in the way that we work? And then let's do a small pilot on that, plan for that, and see how that goes before we start scaling it. So there's a big pressure to act instead of diagnosing to treat. And here I'm going to plug the second ad insert here of the webinar. My talented colleague Mikkel, he just wrote a white paper and released that in the last 2 weeks, a new white paper called The Growth System, which dives a lot more into actually designing for growth and using a design system to get some of the results that you are doing. That's in order to alleviate this pressure to do instead of solve sometimes that we see in organizations. As I mentioned earlier, the enabling functions or these functional collaborators, we're becoming more and more dependent on them. This could be IT, it could be finance, data. A lot of organizations, they are building AI teams as well. Of course, operations, supply chains. There are a lot of other functions that have different priorities that we are becoming more dependent on in order to deliver on our commercial strategies. And the typical conversation that you hear and see in organizations is that, well, hey, IT, I think we strongly believe that this new tool that we have ideated, that will greatly improve our cross sales, as an example. And the answer is oftentimes, thanks, make a business case and we'll put it on the backlog and you'll see something in 3 years. That's the sentiment, and in many respects, functional collaborators, they are seen as a hindrance to actually getting what you want and need out of your commercial strategy. So the big shift here is actually shifting the conversation and pulling them much closer into the commercial strategy process, despite it not being their domain. And our experience is that they're actually often keen on supporting and collaborating on commercial strategy priorities, but we need to make sure that there's mandate for them to do it, to commit to it, and the big unlock here is actually lowering the entry bar for them, so it becomes easier to squeeze something in or change the priorities a little bit. So the changing conversation is actually bringing them in, collaborating with them, making sure that you understand it's not a priority of theirs currently, but the goal is, how can we make this happen? How can we make a prototype or something so we can make it real and test it before we actually start scaling and getting the executive priority to make the MVP or the prototype happen? That's the big unlock here, bringing them close in, bringing them in early, and just getting the mandate to do something small to get specific results before going big and having to do a big development project or the like with IT or finance on reporting or operations to change how you can deliver certain products or services, etc. The third thing here is about harmony. So you have to harmonize what's important for the individuals that are going to drive the execution of the commercial strategy with the commercial strategy in itself. And I think we see this a little bit too often, that what's important for the commercial strategy, which in many respects is very sound on paper, we want to increase our cross-sales rates, we want to get higher margins on our solutions, we want to do new monetization models, of course, realize the price increases and work with that more intelligently, new logos, more upselling, reselling, higher efficiency, etc., etc. You all know the items that typically go on a commercial strategy. But then when it comes to the individual and those that are going to drive it, there's a dissonance. Well, the things that are on the commercial strategy, will they actually help realize my revenue target or however I'm incentivized? Or would that be something that actually kind of works a little bit against what I am incentivized and prioritized to do? Will leaning in on this actually help my career and my personal growth goals? Am I equipped to be able to execute on some of these things? Do I feel and experience a gap in my capabilities? Is this just work on top? Is that how I'm perceiving the commercial strategy on top of my normal duties? And can I see you can say the purpose? And will I get recognition from actually leaning into the commercial strategy? So if you're not incentivized, equipped, informed, and encouraged to act on the commercial strategy, it's really hard to accelerate. It's hard to say that the culture will drive it alone, or that the team spirit will drive it alone. You have to harmonize the priorities on the commercial strategy with the priorities of the people that are going to drive it. And last one here is actually using what you have instead of waiting for these new products. I think for a lot of companies, especially in manufacturing, industrials, those that have physical products, they have the process around getting a new product from idea to market down to a T. And they've built up a lot of capability around that. But then when it comes to commercialization, it's a little bit more wishy-washy. There's less emphasis on it because the emphasis is always around what's the next product launch, what's the next service, etc. And the thing when it comes to commercial strategies is that if you're waiting for portfolio reinvention, you're going to be waiting for quite a long time. Because the reality is that before a few decades ago, when you could bring out a new blockbuster product and it would naturally be adopted by the market, that's not the case anymore. There's so much saturation on information, new competitors, your own portfolio is so bloated that it's hard to actually navigate. So waiting for the new product, service, software, or the new monetization and way of buying, or the new variant, if we're talking EPD, it's not going to cut it. And actually, there's an underutilized part, which is actually just being better at selling your existing portfolio. We see quite a lot of companies where the actual unit sales are going down, but prices are going up. So they look like they're growing on paper, but in reality, they are actually not succeeding with sales because unit sales are going down. We're also seeing more and more that, well, when it comes to like-for-like products with yours and a competitor, that deals are lost around something that's not product-related. That could be around the selling process, that could be around delivery or how you engage with the client. We also see quite a lot that actually a lot of the things that are driving new product sales is new variants of old products. which is driving an outsized part, which again leans into you're not good at actually accelerating the whole portfolio. And also in some cases, you're actually quite reliant on a few very capable sellers, and they are driving the new product growth. So the point here is that actually leaning in on the products that you already have and being better at commercializing them is something that is is a big untapped area. So those are some of the barriers. Well, what are then some of the big shifts that commercial strategy owners can make in the way that they approach these challenges in order to reach the goals that they set themselves? I think the first big shift is around actually iterating and evolving. This is kind of the project curve that you see on a lot of commercial strategy initiatives. So you see an issue, then you start a big development project, and there's a lot of waiting time in order to get that to market, especially if you are, again, working with some of those functional collaborators. Then you start seeing some impact, but then you're actually dependent on an exponential growth rate in order to reach your target. So the big shift here is actually getting faster towards deployment, getting something in market earlier, but having a longer improvement window. A lot of times, of course, when it comes to actual products, you have to dot your I's and cross your T's. But when it comes to things that we do in commercial, it can be better to not do the big project, but try and test something out, get a prototype and get something in market, and then have iterations on improving it over time instead. So this could be, let's set up an inside sales function. Well, we can do a big project around that for the whole organization as a one big cut, or we could try and pilot it and get somebody who's talented and change their roles and responsibilities for a short window, see how it works, get some learnings, and then scale it faster and over time. The big idea here is that the acceleration curve or the slope of the curve is actually lower when it comes to the totality of the curve here. So getting a solution in market fast and working to improve that over time beats designing for perfect. The second one, I think a lot of you will recognize, is around actually sustaining attention. So big things, they draw big attentions. You have the big development project. It gets a lot of executive attention and sponsorship during the project. But then when you start deploying it, it goes kind of into reporting mode and it lives its own life until something happens. That could be it's not delivering as expected. We're not seeing the acceleration that we need. Then there's the big course correction. And then once that is designed and implemented, it goes back to reporting. So it's kind of you're acting as a firefighter instead of preventing the fires from happening. And that's the big shift here. Of course, you need attention if you're doing a big development or a big change that goes across the organization. But then afterwards, you have to implement a system so you're sustaining the attention and running what I like to call improvement sprints, where you are not just reporting on the numbers, but you're actually setting time aside to say, how can we improve this further and get it on a bigger track? So prioritizing, making things get better and giving them the attention that they need, even if they're already working, is a way to really accelerate the outputs. And the last one here is build for 10x, working to achieve way beyond the target that is actually set. So targets, they are often set at kind of an incremental value. We need to grow something 5 or 4% a year. And then the question in the commercial strategy team and those that own the different items, they are, how do we reach that target? And that actually makes that doing what we do today, but better, but hashing in a little bit of training or similar, that becomes a viable option. The big idea here is if your objective is actually building for 10x a target, then reaching the target is just a part of the journey and not the destination. And that also means that you will naturally decouple yourself from just throwing more resources into the same system, because I haven't heard that 10xing the sales force is a viable option, and that's also really hard to do, even if it was a viable option. So building for way higher than your target will force you to think in new ways and look at approaching solutions in new light. So these are the three big shifts that I believe will help you get much more out of your commercial strategy. Being better at iterating and evolving things over time in these big development projects. Making sure that you have a system for actually sustaining attention and prioritizing and setting time aside to maintain focus on how to improve the thing that is already in market instead of doing the big bang. And then building for 10x in order to avoid squeezing the lemons and squeezing everything out that you can of the existing team and equipping them with more training or more tools, but actually reinventing how they do work, how we approach things in our commercial strategy. And then the target is just part of the journey and not the destination itself. So that was a little bit on the, you can say, the big thinking around the 4 barriers and these 3 big shifts that I think commercial strategy owners need to instill in their organizations. But all of us, we like low-hanging fruits, and we also like to be practical as well. So I've brought 3 things that are quite overlooked when it comes to actually driving outsized impact in the short term. It can also be part of actually accelerating the outputs that you get in your commercial strategy and some of these radical moves. The first one is something that's actually quite a hot topic now, post-merger integration, but actually doing it on old acquisitions or locations and teams. I think a lot of firms that have an inorganic growth strategy, they often have a pretty good PMI playbook post-integration. They have a process for that, but that process is often pretty set in stone from a time perspective, 100 days, 1 year, and then it's just part of the business. But the reality is that it takes a lot longer to integrate a lot of these companies fully and making them truly part of the organization. But the same also goes for if you're opening up a new office. That's like buying another entity. Or if you have teams where you can see that they are significantly different or behaving in ways that are not aligned with the rest of the teams. So the big idea here is actually utilizing some of the items that are in the PMI playbook and the PMI stream to integrate and get these old acquisitions closer in is a thing that really can boost performance. And what we often see is that what has happened is the acquisition was bought with a certain multiple and an expectation of performance, but they have been trading flat or even slightly downwards. So you've taken all the great things in the acquisition and maybe taken them out of the acquisition. So don't be afraid to actually look at integrating old acquisitions, even if they are 3, 4, 5 years old. And the same goes for offices that are operating differently or even teams as well. The second thing is around incentives. And I mentioned that as a barrier when it comes to commercial strategies. But what we often see is that incentives and targets, they are pretty poorly designed and actually underutilized, but they can really drive excess performance, help align behavior with desired outcomes, and can also help gear up people in order to act on the commercial strategy. And the reason for that is firms oftentimes think too narrowly around how incentives can look and the relative value for staff. And also a lot of times they're just booked, at least mentally, as an overhead cost or cost instead of a cost of sales. If you design it so that it fosters new revenue that you would not have had otherwise, and also fosters excess performance and higher commitment, it can be a really, really good investment. But what we often see is they're pretty poorly designed compared to the outcomes that you actually want to drive. The last one here is around training. But wait, Jonathan, didn't you say earlier that more training is not good? Well, yes, but I think the difference here is that focused capability building around a few topics that you actually know is the problem and not just an issue that can really enhance the outputs without changing anything else. So making it much more focused, tailored instead of off the shelf is something that can really drive things forward. And then I think the second item for that is that you are doing everything for everyone, and that's usually a pretty poor way to approach it. So actually running more differentiated training with some people with high quality and specificity, that can drive some of the outputs that you want to see instead of off-the-shelf generic training. If you're starting from a low base, that can work, but for a lot of companies, they do have quite some maturity in their commercial staff. So it's about what are the few pinpoint areas where if you do something targeted, specific, and of high quality, it can really generate a lot of output for relatively few inputs. So to me, these are three low-hanging items that can drive outsized impact that I think you should have a look at. Have we actually fully integrated and our old acquisitions, locations, and teams, and are they operating on par and delivering on the synergies that we were promised 3, 4, 5 years ago? Do we have the right incentives and harmony between the outcomes that we want to drive and what actually drives the people? And are there some areas where we can do something focused and specific that will help them perform much better than they do today? That was a few low-hanging fruits. A little bit of practical around, okay, so let's design something for 10x. Let's get something in market faster. How do you actually do that in practice? So here's a small and lean process that can help you do that and something to lean against. And you can scale that up and down, but a good ambition is to have something that's pretty lean. The first part is just around actually spending the time on diagnosing. So we know there are a lot of issues. What can we do in order to actually map those and try and diagnose what are some of the core things that are driving the behavior and the current maybe poor performance in some areas. So good exercise here is actually boiling down your commercial strategy map and your commercial model into a single page, because then you only have the important ones, and then spend the time actually focusing in on where the friction points, and can we find the top 3 areas where our effort is highest, but our output is lowest in a relative sense. Spend the time here actually getting in some of those functional collaborators and other peers to validate and get them in on the process here. And if viable, spend some time on just benchmarking. Where do you stand on this item compared to some of your competitors and peers? So once you've actually diagnosed, here are some big friction points that we want to look at. Then it's time to try and start building. My advice here is select one thing that you think could really deliver high impact, and then force yourself to build a lightweight solution. That could be something as simple as an Excel spreadsheet, or a script to help sellers, or an internal tool you build with AI in an afternoon, or a small process change, or changing a role and responsibility description for one person in order to test something out for a period. Key here is actually designing so what are the success metrics, what are the leading and lagging indicators for this is something that could actually work and something that we would like to invest more in. And then here again, get some cross-functional validation, especially if the final product and solution requires their inputs. And then deploy it, see how it works, run iterations, and you need to define how often that should be, whether that should be weekly or bi-weekly. You can, or something a little bit longer than that. Sometimes you can over-engineer and do too many iteration sessions and not let it live, so be aware of that. And also have clear indications on what would make this scale and what would make us kill this initiative. Last one here, it's a pretty busy slide. You'll get it after the session here, but here's just a diagnosis checklist, some good questions that can help spark the right conversation in the team. So the first type is around these half same. What if we cut something in half and still had to deliver the same? How would that change how we would approach it? Same here, if we doubled our output on something, what we need to change in order for us to be able to deliver on this? What would break if we suddenly 2x our sales staff overnight, or 2x our leads, 2x the amount of content, etc., etc. And the last one here is around the 10x here. How will we operate differently if our target was 10x? How will we approach this in a different way? These questions, they are all kind of in the same ballpark, but they really generate some really great responses and forces new thinking with the team that you are working with there. So let's wrap up. There are 3 things that I hope that you take back to your own commercial strategy stream and team. The first one is that radical does actually not equal risk. So the need for higher outputs, that's definitely real, but the way that you approach that, and if you approach that with what are the things that we should do radically different, and where we should reinvent how we work in order to get radically different outputs. The second thing is what I call aligning the base, which are around these 4 barriers. Make sure that there's harmony around how we approach issues and problems and solving. Make sure that we have the collaborations and relationships needed with those collaborators that we are dependent on in order to build the right solutions. That we have incentives and there's congruence between what's important in the commercial strategy and what's important for the team that will drive it. And where to actually build and where to just build on what you already have. And the last thing is around actually shifting your perspective. So refocusing in order to make sure that you build for the right 10x target, that you can operate the initiatives in a way that iterates over time, and you get more time in market in order to get the big impact. That was actually it for today. Here's the last ad plug for the day. Afterwards, I will send the slides to you from today's webinar. I will also give you Mikkel's great white paper. And if you are currently in a commercial strategy process and would like to do a little bit of sparring on how does the commercial strategy approach look today, and is there something that could be adjusted, then write me an email or answer the mail that I send with the slides and the white paper, and we can set up an interaction. We are going to wrap it up here. Thank you so much for joining the webinar as well, and I hope to see you again soon.